I'm delighted to welcome one of the queens of suburban suspense, Louise Candlish. Her novels are known for turning everyday domestic life into page-turning thrillers, and her latest, A Neighbour's Guide to Murder, is no exception. Set in a seemingly peaceful cul-de-sac, this deliciously twisty tale explores what happens when the people living closest to us turn out to be the ones we know least, and maybe shouldn't trust at all. With the perfect blend of sharp observation, psychological tension, and a wicked sense of humour, Louise once again holds up a mirror to the hidden dramas behind closed doors. We'll be talking about neighbourly paranoia, modern suburbia, and how she crafts her famously twisty plots. So grab a cuppa and maybe double lock your front door as we dive into the murky world of A Neighbour's Guide to Murder. Louise, welcome so much. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for asking me on the show. I'm really excited.
So let's get into it a bit. This is not your first rodeo, is it? A Neighbour's Guide to Murder.
No, oh my God. I do lose track and I do lose count, but this is number 18. I'm reliably informed.
From back in 2004 when you first had Prickly Heat come out. Very
Yes,
different
that's
kind of
right.
book to what you do now, though, isn't it? You've really dug deep into the psychological thrillers, which are gorgeously twisty and gritty.
Yeah, absolutely. That first book, which was later retitled An Island Hideaway, should anyone want to dig it out, it was much lighter and less complicated. My books are very complex now and layered. But having said that, I think that if you were going to read all my books, one after the other, you would see the beginnings of, those dark sort of plots in Prickly Heat, The Island Hideaway, because ultimately it's a story of someone who stalks her ex on holiday, which is, not a particularly decent thing to do. And
It's not very
why?
rom-com, is it?
No, oh my God. It was actually marketed as a rom-com. And, I had to point out to people, well, it's not that romantic. And, maybe a little bit of com in there, but no, there's no walking off into the sunset at
Oh,
the
I
end.
love it. I love it. Well, you've gone on a journey. I mean, you've been in the business for 20 years plus now. So of course you're going to change as you change and, your experiences of life add layers to your writing. Is that is that what has kind of drawn you into more of a thriller, the psych thriller genre?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a combination of that where you grow older. I'm in my 50s now. I was in my early 30s when I started writing, and, I hadn't had a family, I hadn't settled down. I was much more interested in, the kind of my peer group and
Mm.
relationships and career. Whereas I think as you start to mature and start a family and start to be, the responsible one in the household, you think in a much more vertical way. So I think in a much more multi-generational way. And then, sort of combine that with the fact that as you get older, you are just much more interested in societal things and politics and, the way we live and, how things are a bit different from a life you lived when you were young. And so when you put those two things together, you get a much more mature and
Mm.
complex story, I think, which is not to say that those very simple linear stories that a younger person writes aren't really wonderful because they are. They're just serving a different purpose, I think.
Different perspective, isn't it? Yeah, and
Yes, yeah.
as we grow, I think it's a richness to what we see and what we can pull from within the stories.
Yeah, totally, and a pragmatism as well, because you're no longer, I'm not sure I ever did believe in a utopia. Or I've always been quite cynical. I think from a young age, I've always had been in touch with my dark side. But I think as you grow older, you become so pragmatic, and that's you tell stories differently because you no longer see in terms of heroes and villains. You understand that everyone is flawed in some way and everyone has an agenda and that Pollyanna just doesn't exist in real life.
We're all so much more nuanced than that, as you
Yes.
say, that polarized version of good and bad, hero and villain. It's interesting, isn't it, to like an unlikable character. You're very good at
Yeah.
drawing us in, and we don't really want to like some of your protagonists, but there's something about them that maybe is a part of us that understands where they're coming from or aligns with why they're doing things.
I think so because that I think that's just that's the duality of being a human, and I think one of my heroes is Patricia Highsmith, talented Mr. Ripley author, and I think for me she really opened the door in my reading for getting the reader almost instantly to root for the bad guy. and to, introduce a murderer or a psychopath, a psychopath or a sociopath, and say, we're cheering him on. We want him to, to get what, get his earthly desires. And so that was a real lesson for me as a writer, because before that, I think I had tried to make characters likable, but they weren't really, I'm not naturally good at that. I think I'm naturally able to, to sort of portray people who are quite layered and do have a murky underbelly. And so once I felt like I had permission to do that, I think things took off in a big way, and that that then drew me into darker stories. But yeah, I think that we all love that. I mean, is there anyone who really loves to root for, the perfect virtuous person? I'm just not sure. I mean, if you go back through literature, when you think of something like Madame Bovary, probably the very first domestic noir book, she's horrible. She's a terrible character, but we really don't want tragedy to befall her as it does. And so I just think it's there in us. We want to read about complicated people doing dark deeds, and we want to know whether they're going to get away with it or not.
All right, well, let's talk about your new book, which is A Neighbour's Guide to Murder. You bring in, and I never do spoilers on the show because nobody wants that, but some of the things that you bring in are very topical, and I love it when authors will bring in something that really needs to be explored and talked about on top of the plot, but through the plot. So one of those is the country's having a housing crisis, and you paint a picture of these beautiful mansions that everybody would like to live in if they could, but it's terribly difficult. Those places don't come up very often. Young people are desperate for trying to find houses, a room, wherever they can be. Can you talk a little bit more about how you explored the housing crisis and then sex for rent,
Yes,
because
yeah.
that's not talked about enough, I think.
No, no. I mean, to my knowledge, this is the first book that explores sex for rent, at least as a, an overt theme. I've obviously, I'm known for Our House and my, so-called property noir. But it tends to be about, in the past, it's tended to be about home ownership. And I've never really tackled the rental crisis. And I wanted to do that in this book. And so, yes, as you say, there's this beautiful mansion block called Columbia Mansions. And our narrator, Gwen, is an older, retired, divorced woman. And she is living in one of the beautiful flats. And her young, well, her 30-something son, maybe not so young, he's boomeranged back. So he
Not
is
uncommon these days
not
either.
uncommon. Yeah, I try to present a few young people and in this building, and, they're the different reasons why they're there. But the key relationship is between Gwen and her new neighbour, who's called Pixie. She's a 20-something. She has arrived as renting a room with Alec, who is Gwen's neighbour across the hallway. And it's a rent-a-room scheme, the government rent-a-room scheme. So, so far so good. But pretty quickly, Gwen, who is, is a nosy neighbour, let's be frank, she starts to feel that there's something a little bit odd about the relationship between Alec and Pixie. And she is the kind of person who, when she takes the ball and runs with it, she'll be a dot on the horizon. She really, can catastrophize.
She could be quite annoying.
So, yes, but what she does do is she uncovers a fairly murky rental arrangement between Alec and Pixie, which is known as sex for rent, but which is a real thing. And there is, it is in fact legally a crime. It's a sexual offence, but it's also one of those grey areas that's extremely hard to prove, and the victims are unlikely to ever call the police about it because it's a matter of survival. And so, while that's not, the sort of overriding sort of storyline, I think it's kind of there in the background. Pixie's just trying to survive, and then we also have the son, who is also, he's recently divorced and trying to survive. And then we have another young person who is a nepo baby who has, had everything handed to her on a plate, and the three worlds coalesce in to create a scandal in the building, and then eventually, unfortunately, as the title suggests, a murder.
Yes, I love the way that you weave these characters together, and Yeah, I feel for Gwen. Her life has changed. She's very active. She goes to her Pilates classes. She's coffee and gossiping with her other neighbors. She wants to feel needed, doesn't she? And she's a bit of a curtain twitcher. She know sometimes you need those in a building. You do need somebody who keeps an eye on
Absolutely.
what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, she uncovers something very unsavory. She's correct, or is she? The reader will find out because there are unreliable elements to Gwen's narration. But yes, she's had a terrible time. She's been a victim of a husband in the past who was up to nefarious deeds in their shared charity business. She's had a relationship in the past with a young person where she, carries terrible guilt about that. And so, as one thing I love about reading and writing is just bringing a whole life story's worth of experiences into the decisions we make in a present day dilemma. And so, when you know about what's happened to Gwen in the past, you start to see why she is so strangely overprotective of,
Mm.
what amounts to a brand new friend. She doesn't know Pixie from Adam when we open the book, but she believes they're kindred spirits and she wants to do right by her because she did wrong by someone else in the past. And so, it's psychologically, I think, very true and very deep, and also, I think, quite sad ultimately.
I think it makes her very authentic, very believable that all these things have happened for her and she's trying to make amends in many ways, but she
Yes.
just doesn't quite know where to draw the line in terms of, just stepping into it a little bit too much nosiness,
Yes,
causing fuss and
he is.
the uncomfortable situation that she finds herself every time she steps out of her front door.
That's right. And we haven't even mentioned the other character, Maya, yet, who is Gwen's daughter, and she has set herself up as a trad wife. So, there's this other influence. Gwen is this, sort of former career woman. She's an activist. She's what we used to call a sort of do-gooder, I suppose. And so for her, it's mortifying that her daughter has taken on this, very sexualized anti-feminist role in her life. And so, again, she's sort of surrounded by these young people's stories and she feels powerless. So when she does have the opportunity to act, she seizes it.
Completely. The trad wife trend, perhaps a little bit influenced by Meghan as well,
Yeah.
Duchess.
Yeah.
The sourdough in the kitchen, everything is perfect when you're still wearing lipstick and looking gorgeous, and everything's, put an edible flower on it, and it'll all be lovely. Um,
Absolutely. And so hard
yes,
for, sort of my generation of, feminists. It's incredibly hard for us to see young people embracing that because, it's like, do you know how recently, we started to be treated seriously and as equals? And, don't give it away quite yet,
Mm.
please.
When we look back at the women's movement of the late 60s and how far we've come, but
Yeah.
how fragile that line is now as we're
Yes.
seeing played out in the States. And yet,
Yeah.
some of these influencers are, going the trad wife route. I couldn't agree with you more that they don't have the knowledge that we do. Looking back, we would have been very, very young, of course, you and I, Louise,
Yes, of
at that
course.
time. Tiny, not, just babies at the time. But all the women who did that for us, all the hard work and the campaigning. And it's hard to remember that, women couldn't even get a lease by themselves or a
Oh my
credit
gosh.
card
Yes.
or,
Yeah,
rape wasn't a crime within marriage, all
that's
these
right.
things that we could
Yes.
lose if we just fripper away our hard fought rights.
That's
On,
right. And yet, the younger people, I suppose, because it's never cut and dried. It's never black and white, is it? And then a younger person would say, well, hang on a minute, I'm making £200,000 a year from being an influencer or on OnlyFans. Who's the idiot? It's a form of independence and it certainly can be lucrative, but I think it does sell a dangerous lie.
mm,
And ultimately self-respect is important, I think. And if ever I'm advising young people, I always say, can you imagine a young man doing that, or, deciding to take that decision? And, what's the difference there? There are ways forward and there are ways to make money without sort of making it sexual. But this is what this book is about. And, it's about the power of sex and the value of sex. And, the fact that, there are people. I mean, this is I guess, a glamorized version of it because it's a beautiful building, and people are educated, and they have the kind of appearance of making choices in someone like Pixie, whereas in reality, you're talking about people on very low incomes who have no choice whatsoever and are seriously exploited.
Mm.
But it is a decision that Pixie makes, and to get free rent or discounted rent, that's worth thousands of pounds a month.
It's
And
attractive. I
yeah,
mean, I can't
yeah,
lie. That would be an attractive for somebody early in their career when they don't have a lot of budget and
yeah,
there's nothing much around anyway.
that's right. It's almost I think sort of akin to something like the sugar daddy trend.
Mm.
It's a kind of murky form of escort work where it is possible to tell yourself that you're the one in charge and you're the one who's got the power. But
You've
that's why
got
it's so interesting, because it's really not a kind of black and white issue. It's very, very grey.
Well, let's look at your writing process then. When you go into a new novel, and you've had rather a lot of them, do you look at the end and work backwards? Do you have the plot fully formed? How do you form your narrative and get into it?
It varies from book to book, but generally I will have a few themes that I want to explore, or a few plots that have been, kind of bubbling away in my mind as I finish the book before, or tour the book before. It might be a particular kind of narrative plot twist that I've read or seen in a movie, and I think, oh, I'll try that. I'll put that in a modern setting and see if I can do that. And so there might be four or five of those things, a subplot, a property theme, a narrative technique I want to try, a particular kind of character that I haven't really sort of, brought to life before. And in this case, Gwen, I've never had an older narrator before. I've never she's 70 years old. I've never written an older woman before. And I really had, in my 50s now, I've started to notice so much that kind of famous invisibility of the middle-aged woman. And I thought, I'd really like to put that in a book, because, she's just because you're 50, 60, 70 or 80 doesn't mean that you feel invisible. You still feel like you've got a lot to give, and you might still feel like a sexual creature. And, I wanted to explore how Gwen feels about that. And so, yeah, so all of those elements will be bubbling away, and then I'll try and weave them together into a story. And then without a huge amount of planning, but with some planning, I will then set off and try and sort of establish the voice of the narrator. For me, that's the most important thing, to get in the head of the narrator.
Hmm.
And then it tends to flow quite naturally if I do that, if I can achieve that quite early on. And I was luckily able to get Gwen's voice quite quickly, and so that helped move the story, from chapter to chapter, because I knew exactly the kind of thing that she would be thinking and doing and suspecting, and all of her overreactions. And then I really just needed to bring in the other characters and see what she did with them. But
Mm.
I will always know the crime, in this case, a murder. I'll always know, who's going to be murdered, who's done it. I might not know if I'm going to let them get away with it. Because one thing you definitely don't get in my books is that guarantee of justice, either formal
Or
or
happy
informal.
endings.
Yeah, yeah, it's possible for murderers to get away with it, in my books, absolutely. And so I might not know that. I might wait for the mood to establish itself and what feels like the right sort of balanced ending. And I'm now writing the next book, in fact, and I'm at that point where I'm thinking about the ending, and it's established itself quite nicely and naturally what should happen, because I wasn't sure when I started.
Well, let's
Um,
flip back then to one of your
yeah,
very well-known books, partly because it made it onto our ITV screens, Our House, which was a crime and thriller book of the year at the British Book Awards, another real estate
yes,
drama, if you like, property noir. I love that for a genre. What a
yeah,
great name. But that was a real hook. That was a four-part series, adaptation of your book with Martin Compston and Tuppence Middleton, love that name, playing Fiona. What a horrific scenario to come home and find that your house has been sold and you don't know where
I
The
know. Yeah.
contents, your family, your husband is.
Yeah,
What?
it was
Uh,
an extraordinary hook. I read about that crime or that attempted crime in a feature in the Daily Mail. That's where I got the idea. And I had a kind of, goosebumps moment where I thought, oh my God, this would be an incredible plot line in a thriller. And in the real crime, it was a faceless gang, and there were no personal relationships between the various parties. It was professional criminals attempted to steal a house. And so, that this is, the sort of novelist's mind at work. You immediately think, well, how can I make that more interesting? How can I make the stakes
make it
higher?
worse.
Yeah, and as I say, I have these different strands all waiting to see if they can be woven into a story. And I had become really fascinated by bird's nest parenting. Which is when at the time when I wrote the book, it wasn't known at all, and I was talking about it a lot in interviews like this. It's when the parents have split up, but the family house remains, and the parents take it in turns to live in the house. And so I had that in my mind, and then I saw this crime about someone trying to someone selling a house without the owner knowing. And then I thought, ooh, actually, we've got a situation where one of the parents could do it to the other because they're not in the house at the same time. Because the first question you would ask is, how can you sell a house without doing any viewings? Well, you can do viewings if you're the one who's there at the time and your
Mm.
wife is away on holiday. You can do an open day, and everyone can come and have a look at your house. So yes, that came from a real life crime, and quite a lot of my ideas do come from real life, which is why they are topical and often involving, social issues like sex for rent and the rental crisis, because that's where I get my ideas and inspiration is from the news and
Yeah.
features.
So you're already writing your next. When's that due out?
Yeah. I think next year, I think next summer, provided it is liked by my editor and publishing team. I'm only about halfway through, but yeah, I've been writing almost one a year since that very first book of The Stalker. I've written almost one a year. I've had a couple of years where I've had a bit more time, including when I was writing Our House, actually. So yeah, the bandwagon continues, and
Keeps moving
honestly,
on.
yeah,
Lucky
we'll
for
never
us.
run out of interesting themes. I mean, fraud is easily the defining
Romance
problem.
scams,
Yeah,
fraud.
yeah.
There's just, sadly, there is so much material out there.
Yes, there is. Yeah, there is. And I do try and weave it in an entertaining way with some humor, some gallows humor as well, because, we don't want a bleak read. But at the same time, I think fiction is a great way of exploring and understanding, the way we live, in a satisfying way, I think.
All right, final question, Louise. What's on your bedside table? What are you reading
Um,
right now?
well, I'm always reading books that haven't yet come out because, as authors, and I'm sure you're the same, we're always getting books in advance. So I've just read a great book, and I've got it in front of me because I've got a terrible memory and I wouldn't be able to remember the author's name. So it's Anna McPartlin, actually, who is a well-known author, and her new book is The Silent Ones. When's it out? It's going to be out, I think maybe September soon. Anyway, so look out for it. It's set in the 80s in Ireland, and a newborn baby, is found on the beach, murdered. And so it delves in talk about delving into, uncomfortable issues. This delves into, how it was for a woman in Ireland, in the culture at that time, to find herself, pregnant without wanting to be, and the various options or lack thereof
Lack
open to
thereof.
her. Yeah, so
Hmm.
it's a procedural book. It's really fantastic. And then the next one I've got on my list is the new Laura Lippman, which looks to me like it might be the beginning of a new series. It's called Murder Takes a Vacation, and it looks like cozy crime. So that's
We
my
do
next.
like a murder, don't we?
We do. Yeah, we do.
So, Louise Candlish, thank you so much for joining me. A Neighbour's Guide to Murder out on 17th of July. A great read. Congratulations to you. And thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's been great.